Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to a Let's Chat About Inclusive Education session. I'm here with my fellow hosts, Diane Richler and Jackie Speck. And our guest today is Rob Lattanzio, who's I'm going to start over. I don't want to start by Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our Let's Chat About Inclusive Education session. I'm Gordon Porter, the Director of Inclusive Education Canada, and I'm here with Diane Richler and Jackie Speck, who are my fellow hosts of these sessions. Our guest today is Rob Lattanzio, who's the Executive Director of ARCH, a disability rights group in Ontario. Welcome, Rob, and can we start by just getting a sense of who you are and why you happen to be interested and passionate about inclusive education?
Thanks so much, Gordon, and thank you for inviting me for this chat. Well, I am a lawyer and executive director at Arch Disability Law Center, as you mentioned, and so inclusion in every context is what we do, and it is our mandate to advance the inclusion of persons with disabilities. In terms of inclusive education, in particular, education and inclusive education is in many ways what actually got me into the practice of law. Prior to going to law school, I had worked in a number of different settings, working on advancing inclusion for persons labeled with intellectual disabilities in homes and vocational settings and educational settings as well. And in some ways, it coincided with some events that occurred around trying to advance inclusive education in Ontario and trying to establish a presumption of inclusion in Ontario through the Eden case, that Eden and Brant County Board of Education that was going on, through the 90s until it went to our highest court, the Supreme Court of Canada. And in the middle there, at the Court of Appeal, there was an amazing decision by then Justice Arbour. And as someone who was working in the community and had never even thought about the practice of law in terms of advancing inclusion at the time, especially reading a decision like that was completely opened up so many possibilities. And so from there, I certainly always thought about inclusive education as being one of the cornerstones in terms of achieving inclusion in our society generally.
Okay, now ARCH provides support to families or individuals in Ontario. Can you tell us just a little bit more about what ARCH does?
Definitely, happy to do so. ARCH has been around for over 40 years now, and we have a provincial mandate. We're located in Toronto, Ontario, but we do have a mandate to serve the entire province of Ontario. So we do that in a number of different ways. We have a legal practice that really touches on many different areas of law, because as we know, there are many different areas of law that impact the lives of persons with disabilities, and certainly a lot of systems that create barriers for persons with disabilities across Ontario. So education is one of those areas that we practice in. And we do that in a number of different ways. The first service that I really would like to stress here is that we offer a summary advice and referral service to every person with a disability across Ontario. And we offer free and confidential legal advice to persons with disabilities in a number of different areas of law, and that includes education law. And this is summary advice, but sometimes it's really, really important to get that initial advice to understand what your options are and understand what kind of strategies and what kind of processes you need to embark on. So from there, we do have other services. We provide representation in some systemic cases. So we do take on test case litigation. And we also do a lot of law reform and policy work, as well as public legal education and community development work, and also some education for the legal community and the judiciary as well. Actually, if I could add, for anyone who would like to know more about Arch, they can certainly peruse our website. We have a website at archdisabilitylaw.ca, and we have some materials that are specifically around education, as well as a quarterly newsletter, and there are other information there that that folks may find
So
interesting.
Rob, the individual cases that you get requested to support families with, what's the typical kind of difficulty the family's having? Can you generalize about that?
Sure, I think, you know, in terms of some of the main sort of issues, they kind of range, but they flow from in terms of the cases that we get. You know, a lot of the cases may revolve around the failure to provide meaningful and individualized accommodations, for example, or actual access to education services. But they all stem from some fundamental um, key similarities. So there are, you know, kind of pieces around the failure or breakdown of communication, for example, between the student and the family and the school, and um, issues around, you know, that really flow from the archaic nature of the legislative framework that we're dealing with, for example. So, you know, the lack of accountability, the lack of transparency, the lack of appropriate and meaningful dispute resolution mechanisms, for example, that are available to students with disabilities that are trying to receive services and education that are meaningful to them and that are accommodated in an individualized way. So there are some real structural problems, you know, that are at the core of most of the cases that we get, you know, including, for example, exclusion from school, where again, you know, the current framework that we have allows for this kind of practice to happen. So there are some similarities, although as you know, as we can all imagine, most of these cases, or rather all of these cases, are so fact driven, and they're all very particular in some ways, but in other ways they all have these sort of common themes and common threads.
Well, in our work, we hear from a lot of parents, many from Ontario, who are very frustrated about how they deal with their local school authority, and they feel powerless. They feel like people at the school and at the school board or school division level are simply not willing to work in good faith with them. What can you offer to parents who are feeling like that?
So I think one
Can
of the
you offer them hope? I guess it's not just can art solve their problems. That's not what I'm asking. But can you offer them any sense of positive expectation in those situations?
well, and I think if I can sort of take a little bit of a step back in terms of, you know, some of the key pieces around when one is engaging with a school, you know, there are ways of you know, again, back to my point about maintaining that positive communication, or but there are things that one, you know, when things may be getting bleak, there are still things that one can do in terms of even as simple as like trying to maintain that line of communication, maintaining good records about those communications, for example, getting as much information as you can in terms of what your child's rights are, what kind of supports are available, what type of other types of processes that are available, you know, what are your options, and then in there, you know, in that sort of situation where things are appearing to break down a little bit, I would really stress that. And again, I'm not specifically talking about Arch, but in the early stages of that, you know, to get some kind of summary legal advice, to get some kind of advice that really offers you a starting point in terms of what, you know, what your options are. The facts are always so important and particular and individualized, and so in any one particular case, there may be more than one option or more than one strategy, and so it's really important to get that advice early on, so that one can plan, you know, in terms of achieving whatever result or remedy that they're hoping to achieve. So I hope that's a message of hope in terms of, there is some control to some degree, because I think in these experiences that our clients have, that's the issue, is that there is a feeling of complete loss of control. There's a complete imbalance of power. There's no information flowing. There's no process or no oversight or accountability that assists in that. And so, yeah, there is that feeling of despair. But there certainly are strategies to help with that. I don't think there is one solution, but there are some strategies to help.
I think it's really interesting, Rob. You speak about, by the time people come to you, they have given up, right? They've been so beat down by the system. And so I think that piece of advice of getting advice early before everything does fall apart is really useful. And I'm wondering, how do we get that message out to parents that it doesn't have to have fallen apart before you start to get some support, or feeling that you're on your own until everything falls apart and then you have to seek legal advice.
Right. And I think, again, when I think about some of the cases that we're involved in, I think about how important getting other types of supports besides the legal supports.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm certainly not suggesting that people need to get a lawyer right away. In fact, I think in a lot of cases that's not necessarily the right thing. But although getting legal advice would be helpful, but getting other types of supports as well, and trying to bring in that other expertise into the dialogue with the school. And sometimes that can be very, very effective and persuasive. So surrounding oneself with experts within your community, within other professional services that your child is receiving, for example, can provide that support as well.
If I can jump in with a question, Rob, you talked about some of the fundamental problems that exist with the current legislation in Ontario. And I know that one of the things that you've been really interested in is the international convention, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to which Canada is a state party. So that is supposed to mean that we as a country will abide by the terms of the convention. And when Canada was reviewed by the committee in Geneva that does those things, we were found to come up pretty short. My experience is that even though Canada is a party to that convention, unlike other conventions, Canada took a real lead on the Landmines Convention, or Canada took a real lead on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and made sure that we were respecting those both domestically and internationally. When it comes to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, I would be curious to know how many ministers of education have any idea what the convention says and what they are supposed to be committed to. And certainly within the bureaucracy, within the officials who are responsible, I wonder how cognizant they are of the terms. What's your sense? Because I'm doing a lot of work internationally, and I'm curious both from a Canadian perspective and for people in other countries. How can we use the convention? How can we take advantage of the fact that Canada has stood up to the United Nations and said, we believe in inclusive education, we believe in an inclusive system at all levels, and yet allows what's happening in Ontario to happen?
That's a great question. I mean, we talk a lot about leadership, and we talk a lot about leadership as being key to achieving inclusive education. And a lot of that discussion happens in terms of leadership at the school level and at the school board level, but we also need leadership in terms of how do we get to where Article 24 tells us where we need to be, right? So where is the leadership around implementing elements of Article 24 in the frameworks across Canada, right? Ontario certainly being one that needs some significant reforms. And I certainly don't have the answer, in terms of what is the most effective strategy. I think there are a number of them, and some of them perhaps are within the convention itself, where there are processes, for example, around reporting, and civil society has continued to identify issues with the lack of implementation. And there are some other processes as well in the convention, that may offer some assistance, and the optional protocol. But I think it's really important to remember that the convention was ratified by Canada, which means that Canada has taken on these obligations. And when we think about Article 24 at its most basic, I guess, for a lack of better word, is the fact that at the very least we need to remove segregated schools, for example, but we still have them in Ontario. So there's really a complete inconsistency in terms of what we think Article 24 means, and what is actually happening on the ground here in Ontario. I mean, if we think about the framework that's dominant in the Education Act, which really was created decades ago, in a completely different reality, when school boards were now in a position where they had to provide services to students with disabilities. Our framework now in the Education Act, which is the Identification, Placement, and Review Committee, is really all about identifying, labeling, and placing. And there is a whole legal process and a tribunal, and all of that is created around those two pieces. But if we think about what students really need, what do our students really need? They need to make, they need meaningful education, and that takes on a lot of different forms, including individualized accommodations, for example. And you won't find that in that framework, right? So we can identify a child and we can place a child, but then there actually is really not much in the Education Act about what goes into an individual education plan, or what happens if they don't follow the individual education plan, and what happens if they're developing it without the child and the family, right? It's completely silent on that. And so families now have to kind of take what's happening and start framing it through a human rights lens, which is a process that's available to families and is not necessarily really built for this issue in terms of the timeliness, in terms of a whole host of factors. And so again, that inconsistency around how the Human Rights Code has evolved, and how we think about education from a human rights framework. So we think about students as rights holders, but yet you have an Education Act that still thinks about different things, and thinks about identification, placement, and best interest, and those two don't always really work well together when a child is trying to receive meaningful education at their school.
So Rob, just the question of segregated schools, standalone schools, which are still present in Ontario, in Toronto, and in other communities as well. Is the law the way we can address that, whether the charter or the convention? Do they have any hope of ending that practice, or is it going to have to be through more educational and activity by parents outside the legal framework?
Well, it's an interesting, it's certainly an interesting question. The case I referred to earlier, the Eaton case, was a case that attempted to establish a presumption of inclusion in Ontario, and ultimately, in terms of that goal, wasn't successful. It certainly was successful in establishing a better understanding of the duty to accommodate for persons with disabilities. But I think law has a very particular purpose, and I think that is going to be part of the solution. But there are other elements to it. As we just talked about, there's an international treaty that Canada has ratified that speaks directly to this. But you raise something really important in terms of what do parents think, what do communities think, and there are, until there's a groundswell, of understanding in terms of the shift that's needed from a policy perspective and from a legal perspective, I suppose, things will continue, right? Until, until there's that clear push. And I think for me, in my mind, I think ratifying the CRPD with Article 24, in many ways is that push. I think that's a clear indication of where we need to be. There's a blueprint there now that our country has ratified. So,
but who's going to tell provincial ministries that they must, for example, close segregated schools? Is it going to be the federal government? And if so, which part of it and under what conditions? Like, that doesn't seem to be the way Canada works.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And there's the jurisdictional realities, right, that we have to deal with. There's no doubt. And I think, and so there are limitations, right? But there's still, there can be a role to some degree for a national strategy, for example, on inclusive education and on implementing Article 24. But the complete other side to it is that there are opportunities locally in the province to make this an issue, right? To politicians and to really try to push this agenda through our representatives, in the province.
We don't have time to pursue this in detail, but one of my real frustrations is that a lot of people who consider themselves advocates for human rights for all just do not see the right to inclusive education as a human right. And in fact, I would go so far as to say they don't see the rights of people with disabilities as human rights generally, the kind of things that you were talking about at the beginning, Rob. And I just wonder, if you see any way to get more human rights advocates on our side, because I don't think they're fighting with us. I think they're often fighting against us.
And I think, that's also a really, really, a really interesting point, because if we think about the CRPD, in many ways, the convention doesn't really offer us new rights, right? The convention ultimately offers us, there's 50 provisions, about 25 of them are substantive. All of those 25 really flow from other treaties, but why did we need the convention? We needed the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities because those rights that are enshrined in other treaties aren't in any way close to being relevant for persons with disabilities, right? There is this reality that we have to really think about the ableist structures that are in existence in all of our communities in a bit of a different way. So, for example, the right to education is enshrined in actually a number of treaties, and the right to education is actually very different than the right to education for students with disabilities, and that's exactly why we have Article 24. It was really to give an understanding to the existing human rights, so that we understand human rights through that disability rights lens, and we apply that to all of the articles. If we think about access to justice, it means something different for persons with disabilities. It actually means not only access to justice as we know it, enshrined in the Declaration and other treaties, but also, accessing procedural accommodation so you can actually be part of the hearing, right? Which able-bodied individuals don't have to sort of be concerned about, or for example, Article 12, around decision making. I mean, there is a need to understand these rights that are enshrined or in the practice of advancing human rights through, for example, the Ontario Human Rights Code, but through that disability rights lens and through an intersectional lens as well, which again leaves us in at times a different understanding than what perhaps a a sort of a human rights analysis devoid of these lenses. And it's what we would argue to be true substantive equality, where you really have to be considering, all of these other elements.
Jackie?
Yeah, excuse me. I think that, that is really one of our biggest issues, right? Is we have this Canadian government that agrees to things, but then we don't have any teeth to say provinces, this is what you must do. And I think we are so different than most other countries, and that's really the issue. But I do appreciate that idea that we do still have to then, push locally and push provincially in order to make these changes, because I do think it's only through the law and the policy that these changes are going to be made. So I thank you for the work that you and Arsh do, Rob.
Rob, I was chair of the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission 10, 15 years ago, that time period. And in 2008, we had a major national conference that I think almost every human rights agency in Canada attended, as well as people from the education community and folks like yourself. You were there, I recall. And I guess my question is, how would you assess the degree to which human rights commissions are assisting families in accessing inclusive education in the country? Are they, and I don't mean that you should do a coast to coast review, but in a general sense, how do you think they're doing, and why do you think they're accomplishing the degree to which they are?
Well, it sort of takes me back to Diane, to your question about, like, are human rights advocates and human rights tribunals, for that matter, understanding human rights in the way that meets the way that we understand human rights through a substantive equality lens as it relates to persons with disabilities. It's a really good question. I mean, I think you raise a really good point about how human rights commissions, which I should state, have different mandates in different provinces, right? And so, commissions are different in some provinces. They also act as gatekeepers, where or at least they take on complaints and make decisions about, which complaints will go to a trier of fact, to a tribunal or not. But regardless of that, I mean, I think the human rights commissions in every province and territory, are certainly have a role here, right? When we talk about this shift that's needed in terms of how we understand. So, for example, here in Ontario, and I know in other provinces as well, one of the mandates of a human rights commission is to ensure that they create policy, that advances human rights for the citizens of that province, and the interpretation of the human rights statute of that province or territory. And so, if we also have stronger policy from commissions across the country about how the duty to accommodate, for example, and how their human rights statutes are to be interpreted, for example, within the education context, and if then human rights tribunals, start using those interpretations in terms of how they render decisions, then that certainly gets us a lot further along, than where we are. So there are, as we were discussing earlier, there are certainly a lot of different ways here, and a lot of moving parts and a lot of pieces, to this puzzle that need to be pushed along.
Well, Rob, we've appreciated you be part of our little chatter here today. Our time's nearly up, but I have one more question for you, and that is on a functional level. We know the wonderful work that Arch does through you and your team in Ontario, but is there a national network of some kind, probably informal rather than formal, of lawyers who identify with work about, well, human rights, but particularly about inclusive education or disability rights in Canada? Does that exist, or is it not something very visible?
Well, I certainly think of maybe not so much lawyers. I think there are two of us, but I think of IEC and I think of the work that IEC is doing, and that certainly is, in my mind, an amazing network to pull us all together across the country. There are a couple of things that come to my mind. We chair the Association of Human Rights Lawyers in Ontario. And it's not specific to education, but this is an association of human rights lawyers in Ontario, and it gives us an opportunity to have discussions on a number of different areas, and education, does come up. In terms of nationally, there may be others. The one that comes to my mind is we just completed a project that was funded by the federal government around the CRPD and the optional protocol. And one of the things that we're hoping as a legacy piece from that project is to maintain that network of lawyers that participated in part of that project. And so again, maybe not specific on education, but still an important opportunity here to keep some disability rights lawyers across the country together and talking about these issues.
So perhaps that's something that Inclusion Canada or Inclusive Education Canada or both could be partners in, trying to facilitate something like that. Okay, with that, I want to thank everyone. Thank you, Rob, so much for being with us. And thank you, Jackie and Diane. And we hope our listeners have found the discussion interesting, as we have. And we invite them to tune in for the next Let's Chat about inclusive education. Take care.